Today we uncover the shocking truth about UK sausages. Picture this. You're stood at your local supermarket, reaching for a pack of 8 thick pork sausages, and without even realizing it, you're about to hand over your money for something that's barely more pork than it is wheat and H2O, nearly 6 in every 10 grams. Gone, replaced with flour, fat stabilizers, and a coloring made from crushed insects, all doing their best to look and behave like the farmer's meat you think you're buying. Some people have started asking about the percentage of actual meat, not just at the supermarket, but even when ordering sausages in a restaurant or a hotel, actually taking the time to know what you're ordering. And yes, asking the kitchen what the pork content is might sound like overkill, but we're the ones who are going to eat it. And these days, you can't be blamed for being too careful. And once you know just how much that number can swing from one sausage to the next, it stops feeling excessive and starts feeling like common sense. And that's really just the opening act. Somewhere on a UK supermarket shelf right now sits a sausage range that got pulled last year after small pieces of plastic were found inside a pack sitting proudly under a premium label. People who've actually worked on these production lines describe being made to work at a genuinely brutal pace, standing for 8-hour shifts, feeding sausages into a packing machine that never really slows down. At that rate, mistakes are bound to happen. Everything about sausages isn't what it used to be, right down to the color used to make the whole thing look pink instead of grey. Processed meat as a whole category is currently placed by one global health authority in the very same hazard classification as tobacco. People who've actually worked inside meat processing plants describe what a lot of the filling really looks like once you're standing next to the machine. Pork rind, essentially the skin, blended down with fat and a cereal filler called rusk, then ice-cold water added straight into the mix to bulk it out further. By the time it comes out the other end, there's barely any actual muscle tissue left in that portion of the mixture at all. It's mostly skin, fat, and bread. It's the kind of thing you'd probably want to know before you keep buying the same pack out of habit every single week, without ever once turning it over to read what's actually printed on the back. One tip that comes up a lot from people who've made the switch to a proper high-meat sausage: buy it in bulk whenever it's on offer, rather than buying whatever's cheapest that week out of habit. It works out better value in the long run than repeatedly buying a low-quality pack at full price. And plenty of people say once they made that switch from a weekly low-grade sausage to a proper one bought less often, the difference in taste was honestly staggering. Night and day difference. So that's exactly what we did. We went through the major fresh sausage brands currently sitting on UK supermarket shelves right now, checked precisely what's inside every single one of them, worked out who actually owns each brand once you follow the money up the chain, and compared all of it against how a proper British sausage used to be made before big business got its hands on the recipe. We'll expose the 11 fresh pork sausage products you genuinely need to think twice about, plus one brand that seems to split the entire country right down the middle, depending who you ask. Then, once that's done, we'll hand you the handful that are actually worth putting in your trolley this week. Before we get into it, if any of what you're about to hear is news to you, or if it simply confirms something you've suspected for years, hit that hype button right now. Before you forget, it genuinely matters more than you'd think. Every single hype pushes this in front of more people who are about to do their weekly shop tomorrow, without knowing any of this. And the more of us who actually know what we're picking up, the harder it becomes for these companies to keep quietly cutting corners while charging us more for the privilege. This isn't about telling anyone what they're allowed to eat, and it's certainly not about looking down on anyone for buying what they can afford. It's about making sure the choice sitting in your trolley is actually an informed one, rather than one built entirely on clever packaging and a name you happen to recognize. So hype it, share it with anyone in your life who does the family shop, and drop us a comment as well while you're at it, because we genuinely want to know what you think once you've heard the whole list. And let's get into it. Number 11. Tesco's Woodside Farm pork sausages. This one sits at 47% pork, made up with pea flour, reconstituted dry pork rind, potato starch, and dextrose filled into a casing made using pork sourced from the UK and beyond. But the ingredient list isn't even the most interesting part of this story. Back in 2016, Tesco quietly retired the old Tesco Value name and replaced a big chunk of its budget fresh food range with a set of brand new, very English-sounding farm names. Woodside Farms for pork, Willow Farms for beef, and a handful of others sitting alongside them. The problem is that real farms already existed under some of those exact names. A Nottinghamshire pig farmer called Richard Bohr had genuinely run a free-range operation called Woodside Farm for 20 years, and once Tesco's branding appeared on supermarket shelves, he found himself constantly fielding questions from customers asking whether he supplied the supermarket. He didn't, and he'd never agreed to any of it. He teamed up with a food campaign charity and called the whole thing out publicly, and Tesco ended up facing real pressure from farming groups over it. To their credit, one of Tesco's biggest rivals looked at the backlash, ran their own research, and dropped the fake farm approach entirely once they found most shoppers genuinely felt misled by it. Tesco kept theirs on the shelf, and it's still sitting there today, more than a decade later, still borrowing the warmth of a farm name that was never theirs to use in the first place. Number 10. Richmond Thick Pork Sausages. 42% pork, which is the exact legal floor for anything sold in this country as a pork sausage. You've probably already heard that number before. This brand's been the poster child for it for years now, so we won't dwell on it too long. What's more interesting is what's actually happened above your head while you've been buying them. Richmond is made by Pilgrim's Foodmasters, and Pilgrim's itself is majority owned by JBS of Brazil, the largest meat processing company on the entire planet. The packet still leans hard on heritage, loved by families for well over a century according to the branding, but the meat inside comes from the UK and beyond, exactly as printed on the pack, in far smaller writing than the slogan above it. The rest of that 58% is water, wheat rusk, pork fat, wheat starch, soya protein, a handful of stabilizers, and a color listed simply as carmine, a red dye made from crushed cochineal insects. Added because without it the mixture underneath would look considerably paler and grayer than the pink you're used to seeing through the wrapper. It's also worth knowing, and this applies well beyond just this one brand, that the meat percentage printed on any sausage pack can legally include a bit of natural fat and connective tissue alongside the actual lean muscle. That's completely normal for a sausage and not some hidden trick. It's just worth understanding so nobody feels like they're being lied to by the number itself. It's what's built around that number that tends to matter a great deal more. Number 9. Wall's Thick Pork Sausages. This one actually sits at 70% pork, considerably higher than a lot of people assume, and considerably higher than several of the names further down this list. So let's give credit where it's due before we get into the rest of the story. Wall's traces itself back to 1786, when Thomas Wall opened a butcher's stall in London's St. James's Market. By 1812, the business held a royal warrant supplying pork to the Prince of Wales, and Wall's own packaging today still references having sat on the tables of 5 separate royal households over the years. That's a genuinely impressive history for a name that now sits inside a mass-produced factory line owned by Kerry Foods, a large multinational food group built around industrial-scale manufacturing rather than a single London butcher with an apron and a knife. The ingredients still include water, wheat rusk, soya protein, potato starch, dextrose, a set of stabilizers, and depending on which pack you pick up, added color to help it look a certain shade once it hits the pan. Thomas Wall never needed any of that with a fresh batch of shoulder and belly and a decent set of hands. What you're buying today carries his name and his history proudly on the front, and a modern industrial process quietly on the inside. And there's a genuine gap between those two things worth being aware of before you reach for it purely out of habit. It's also worth saying, if you've still got a proper local butcher anywhere near where you live, this is exactly the kind of gap they tend to close completely, because they'll happily tell you precisely what went into their sausages before you've even asked the question. Number 8. Asda's Just Essentials Pork Sausages. 51% pork in the fresh chilled 8-pack. Quick word of warning here, because it genuinely trips people up. There's also a completely separate frozen 20-pack, sold under a very similar sounding name that sits at 42%, a totally different recipe, hiding under a similar looking bag, depending which aisle you happen to grab it from. The fresh version is bulked out with water, rice flour, chickpea flour, potato fiber, corn flour, and a handful of stabilizers and preservatives. There's nothing wrong with shopping on a budget. Plenty of people have no choice but to, and that's not what we're having a go at here. The issue is simply that more than half of what's inside this particular pack isn't pork at all. It's water held together with flour and fiber, so the saving isn't quite as generous as it first looks once you actually work out how little meat you're paying for. Asda does sell considerably better sausages elsewhere on the very same fixture, some of them sitting comfortably above 90% pork, which only really goes to show that the budget end and the everyday end of the same supermarket can be worlds apart even when they're stacked on the exact same shelf. Number 7. The Co-op's Honest Value Pork Sausages, 52% pork, made up with rice flour, pea starch, potato fiber, gram flour, dextrose, a stabilizer, and a preservative, filled into a beef casing. What makes this one worth flagging isn't just the number, it's what sits right next to it on the very same shelf. The Co-op's own irresistible range runs as high as the low 90s in pork content, genuinely excellent by supermarket standards, so this company clearly knows exactly how to put together a proper sausage when it wants to. This one just isn't that sausage, whatever the name printed on the front might try to suggest to you at first glance. Calling something honest value when barely half of it is actual meat is a fairly bold choice of wording, and it's worth remembering that name the next time you're stood in front of that particular fridge, deciding which pack to reach for. Number 6. M&S's Outdoor Bred Pork Butcher's Sausages, 60% pork, and this is straight from M&S's own product description, lightly seasoned, described as great for a midweek plate of bangers and mash. Now, it's important to be precise here because this is one specific everyday line, not M&S's collection range and not their premium heritage gold sausages, both of which sit far higher and both of which we'll come back to a little later. But M&S has spent decades building a reputation where shoppers trust the packaging without needing to double-check it, and prices its food halls accordingly when their basic everyday pork sausage sits at 60%, noticeably below what most people walking past that particular counter would probably assume. That's worth knowing before you grab it purely on the strength of the name written above the door. It's a fair reminder that even the more upmarket end of British supermarket shopping still has a budget shelf tucked away somewhere, dressed up in exactly the same green and gold packaging as everything else in the store. Plenty of loyal M&S shoppers will tell you their usual sausage sits closer to 90%, and they're not wrong, because M&S genuinely does make some of the better ranges out there. The point isn't that M&S can't do it properly, it clearly can, and we'll come back to proof of that shortly. The point is that walking into that food hall and grabbing whatever's nearest doesn't automatically get you the good stuff, and this particular line is the one that catches people out. Number 5. Tesco's Butcher's Choice Pork Sausages, 72% pork in the fresh Northern Irish version, made with water, wheat flour, pork fat, dextrose, a handful of stabilizers and preservatives, and a curious little addition of plant and fruit concentrates, including hibiscus extract, black carrot juice concentrated, all quietly doing color work in the background rather than adding any flavor you'd actually notice. The name Butcher's Choice is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, conjuring up someone in an apron hand, picking cuts for you personally, when what you're actually holding is a standard factory recipe, admittedly a decent one compared to some of what we've already covered tonight. One more thing worth knowing, there's also a frozen 20-pack sold under this exact same Butcher's Choice name, sitting at a noticeably lower percentage. So the branding alone tells you nothing about which product is actually in your hand until you actually flip the pack over and read the small print for yourself. Number 4. Sainsbury's Butcher's Choice Pork Sausages, also 72% pork, made with British pork, water, fortified wheat flour, dextrose, a set of stabilizers, sulfur dioxide, a raising agent, sage and parsley, yeast extract, and a run of spice extracts filled into pork collagen casings. Same story, different supermarket, almost as if somebody wrote one memo and every retailer in the country decided to follow it word for word. At this point, Butcher's choice starts to look less like a description of how the sausage was actually made and more like a phrase the whole industry reaches for whenever it wants a product to sound a bit more artisan than it really is. Nearly identical percentage, nearly identical additive list, just a different logo stamped on the front of the bag and a slightly different shade of blue on the packaging. It genuinely raises the question of how many of these value-added sausage names across the industry are built around an actual butchery tradition, and how many are simply a phrase that tested well in a boardroom somewhere, then got quietly rolled out across every single supermarket that could afford the packaging redesign. Number 3. Aldi's Irish-style pork sausages. 42% pork, made with water, wheat flour, wheat starch, guar gum, yeast extract powder, and that same color carmine made from crushed cochineal insects, filled into a beef collagen casing. Aldi has built its whole reputation on undercutting the big supermarkets while still being decent quality. And further down this list, we've got a genuinely excellent Aldi sausage that backs that reputation up completely. But this one sits at exactly the same rock-bottom percentage as some of the worst names we've already covered tonight, right down to sharing that same insect-derived red coloring, same supermarket, sometimes the very same aisle, two completely different sausages depending entirely on which bag you happen to pick up off the shelf that day, and nothing on the front of either bag is going to warn you which one you've actually got hold of. Number 2. Morrison's The Best range. Not every variety carrying that premium label sits where you'd expect it to. Certain flavors, once you add cheese and bacon into the mix, land around 76% pork, made with extra mature cheddar, smoked dry-cure streaky bacon containing sodium nitrite and potassium nitrate as preservatives, rice flour, dextrose gram flour, a run of stabilizers, and calcium alginate casings. Not a disaster by any means, but noticeably lower than some other lines sitting under the exact same premium branding on the very same shelf. And there's a second separate issue worth raising here. In 2025, Morrison's issued an urgent recall on their Cumberland sausages from this same range, after small pieces of blue plastic were found inside the product. With a use-by date of the 1st of May, the Food Standards Agency confirmed the recall and flagged it as a genuine physical contamination risk. To Morrison's credit, they moved fast, pulled the affected batch and confirmed no other lines in the range were caught up in it. And to be fair to the wider industry, packing lines that fill thousands of sausages an hour often rely on workers wearing protective gloves for hygiene reasons, and every now and then a small fragment ends up somewhere it really shouldn't. It happens across the sector, not just here. But when you're already paying a premium for a range with the word best printed right across the front of the packet, you'd hope the quality control matched the branding a little more closely than that. It's worth saying too that other varieties inside this exact same range genuinely do sit much higher, some pushing past 90% pork with a proper coarse texture, which makes the whole range feel a little inconsistent depending purely on which specific bag you happen to reach for that week. Number 1. Iceland's 10 pork sausages, 42% pork, and unlike almost everything else on tonight's list, this one is frozen, not fresh. We've kept this entire countdown to fresh, chilled sausages on purpose, because that's usually the aisle where shoppers expect a bit more honesty than they get from the freezer. But this one earned its place at the very top, regardless, because it's genuinely one of the lowest percentage sausages sitting on a UK supermarket shelf in any form, fresh or frozen, and it's a stark reminder that switching aisles doesn't automatically switch quality. It's made with water, wheat flour, pork rind, dextrose, a preservative, yeast extract containing barley, a stabilizer, sugar, and it's stuffed into a beef collagen casing rather than a natural skin, with that pork rind, essentially processed pig skin, doing a fair amount of the bulking work alongside the flour. 12 years ago now, this country found out that some meat, labelled as beef, wasn't beef at all, and it took laboratory testing, not the label on the pack, to expose it. Nothing on tonight's list is anywhere near that territory, and there's no suggestion any of these products are anything other than exactly what they say they are. But it's worth asking what's actually stopping something like that slipping through quietly again, when so much of what ends up in a sausage casing already depends entirely on us trusting a small percentage printed in tiny writing on the back of a bag we've barely glanced at. Before we get to the sausages actually worth spending your money on, there's one brand that comes up constantly whenever this topic gets discussed, and honestly, opinion on it is about as split as we've ever seen on this channel. Heck sits at 97% British pork, one of the shortest ingredient lists of anything we looked at tonight, just salt, a gluten-free flour, spices, sugar, a preservative, and an antioxidant, filled into a beef collagen casing on most lines. It's also gluten-free across the board, which makes it a genuine option for anyone who's celiac or simply avoiding wheat for whatever reason. On paper, this is about as good as the numbers get. But once you get past the pack and into the pan, opinion genuinely divides right down the middle. Some people swear by it and won't buy anything else, describing it as the first supermarket sausage in years that actually tastes like meat. Others find it surprisingly bland for something with such a strong number on the front, or find the casing chewier than they'd like, closer to a hot dog skin than a proper snap. There isn't really a clean verdict to give you here, so we're not going to pretend there is. One, just to wrap this segment up neatly. Some of that difference in opinion probably comes down to what people are used to. If you grew up on a soft, high-rusk sausage, 97% pork with almost nothing else in it, can taste like a completely different food altogether. Leaner, plainer, closer to a grilled chop than the sausage you remember from childhood. The numbers on the back are about as strong as anything on this entire list. What you actually make of it once it hits your plate is genuinely down to you and your own taste buds, so we'd genuinely love to know which side of that argument you land on down in the comments. So how do you actually find the good stuff? A couple of quick things worth knowing before we get into it properly. Check the percentage on the back, not the name on the front, because as we've just seen more than once tonight, the same brand and even the same supermarket can sell you two completely different sausages depending which one you happen to pick up. And don't assume higher is automatically better in every single case either. A small amount of traditional rusk in an otherwise decent high-meat sausage can actually help it hold on to its juice in the pan rather than cooking dry and tough. So a sausage sitting at a genuinely honest 85 or 90% with a touch of rusk in it isn't something to turn your nose up at purely on principle. And remember what we said earlier, that percentage figure can legally include a bit of natural fat and connective tissue alongside the lean meat. That's completely normal, not a trick. Just worth knowing so you're judging every single one of these fairly rather than expecting something that was never realistic in the first place. One more thing worth mentioning while we're on the subject, cost isn't always the reliable guide people assume it is either. A couple of the names further down this list cost less than several of the brands we've just spent the last few minutes going through, which tells you fairly clearly that a higher price tag doesn't automatically buy you a better sausage. It often just buys you a fancier font. With all that in mind, here's a genuine handful worth putting in your trolley this week. First, Lidl Deluxe pork sausages, 90% British pork, made with water, rice flour, chickpea flour, dextrose, a blend of nutmeg, white pepper and coriander, onion, rubbed sage, a stabilizer, corn flour, a preservative, and an antioxidant filled into a calcium alginate casing. This one's genuine proof that a discount supermarket can put out a properly high-meat sausage without pricing it like something from a farm shop. Plenty of shoppers who've tried it seem consistently surprised at just how far it outperforms what they were expecting for the price. And more than a few have said outright, it's replaced a far more expensive brand in their weekly shop without them ever noticing a drop in quality. Second, M&S Heritage Gold pork sausages, 92% pork and just 6 ingredients on the entire pack: pork, water, salt, black pepper, sage, and natural pork casings. That's genuinely it. No rusk, no stabilizers, no added color, no preservatives either. Nothing hiding behind a long chemical name you can't picture in your head or pronounce out loud. This sits at the exact opposite end of the shelf from the 60% everyday line we covered earlier under the very same M&S name. And it's honestly the clearest proof on this entire list that a retailer can absolutely build a proper sausage when it wants to. It's simply a question of which one ends up in your basket by the end of your shop. Third, the Black Farmer pork sausages, 90% British pork, gluten-free, founded by Wilfred Emmanuel Jones, and built around outdoor reared British pork with a genuinely straightforward ingredient list behind it. This one comes up again and again whenever this subject gets talked about among shoppers, consistently mentioned as an actual household favorite rather than just a decent option people settle for when nothing better is available. It's also one of the few names on tonight's entire list that started life as an independent brand rather than something dreamed up inside a supermarket's own marketing department. Fourth, Aldi's specially selected pork sausages, 97% pork filled into a natural casing. One consumer investigation covering dozens of UK sausage products a few years back found this exact sausage sitting right near the very top of the entire list for meat content, comfortably beating names that cost considerably more per pack. And here's the thing worth sitting with for a second, this sausage is sold on the very same shelves as the 42% Irish-style sausage we covered earlier tonight. Same supermarket, top and bottom of the entire scale, sitting a few feet apart from each other under the same roof. It genuinely comes down to reading the pack properly rather than trusting the shop to have done that thinking for you. Fifth, Waitrose number 1, free-range pork sausages. 97 to 98% pork, depending on the exact pack, filled into natural hog or vegetable casings, made using free-range pigs born and reared entirely outdoors with straw-filled shelters, sired by pedigree Hampshire boars. This is about as close as a supermarket shelf gets to what a proper local butcher would hand you across the counter, and it's one of the very few ranges across this whole investigation that can genuinely back up a true free-range claim. Rather than the vaguer outdoor bred label most of the rest of the industry leans on, where an animal might only have spent its first few weeks outside before being moved indoors for the rest of its life. And that brings us to the end of tonight's list. If there's one thing that keeps coming up every single time this subject gets talked about, it's this. If you've still got a proper local butcher near you, use them. Ask them what's actually in their sausages and you'll get a straight answer on the spot, not a percentage buried in tiny writing on the back of a plastic wrapper. Plenty of you already know this, plenty of you have said it to us before in the comments, and honestly, you're right every single time. Butchers up and down the country are more than happy to talk you through exactly what's gone into their sausages, sometimes right down to the specific cuts. A mix of shoulder and belly pork, rather than anything reformed or mechanically separated. Some of them build proper meat packs you can order weekly or monthly, rather than committing to a big shop every time. And once you actually work out the cost per meal, it's often not the luxury people assume it to be. It's just worth remembering that not everyone still has a butcher nearby, and for a lot of families up and down the country, a supermarket shelf is genuinely the only option going. Which is exactly why knowing which pack to actually pick matters as much as it does. It's just worth remembering that not everyone still has one nearby, and for a lot of families up and down the country, a supermarket shelf is genuinely the only option going, which is exactly why knowing which pack to actually pick matters as much as it does. If this has changed what's going in your trolley this week, hit that hype button before you go. It genuinely helps push this in front of more people who deserve to know exactly what they're buying before they buy it. And every single one of you doing that is a small pushback against companies that would clearly rather you never check the label at all. Let us know in the comments what you think. Tell us if we missed one that should have made this list, and tell us which food you want us to turn our attention to next, because we read every single one of them, every week, without fail. Subscribe if you want more of this, because we're not stopping at sausages. There's plenty more sitting on those shelves that deserves a proper look. Until next time, read the label, trust your butcher, and protect your plate.